On Wednesday, Year 11, you'll have your Literature Paper 1 exam. You will be asked a question on Shakespeare, for which you will answer the Macbeth question, and on the 19th century novel, for which you'll answer the A Christmas Carol question. So tonight's session is going to work through some possible really difficult questions for Macbeth and some key ideas that you could apply to any Macbeth essay regardless of what you were asked. I'll upload the same for you tomorrow night, which will be on A Christmas Carol, and I'll give out sheets with the key ideas from each of the texts for you all tomorrow in the Period 4 booster. So the questions we're going to look at tonight is the question of Banquo, and if Banquo came up as a character, but obviously we know Banquo may be in the extract if he comes up as if it's a theme question as well. We're going to look at the character of Macduff and his role in the play, and if the theme of loyalty came up, we would know that Macduff would be highly significant. We're going to look at King Duncan, and if he came up as a question, and the theme of kingship there. I've highlighted kingship because although I'm not necessarily suggesting that kingship is a tricky theme, it's actually quite a nice theme that we'd perhaps hope came up on Wednesday, but also the idea of kingship seems like a strong prediction for what might be on the exam. Okay, so 6 key ideas for nearly any Macbeth essay. So these are things, and there are quotes in red linked to them, that pretty much, regardless of what you are asked, you can talk about. And they are high-level ideas as well. So you've got the cyclical structure in Macbeth. At the beginning of Macbeth, Macbeth violently beheads the traitor. And at the end, he is violently beheaded by Macduff for being a traitor. Now, on a simple level, you can say that Shakespeare uses the cyclical structure to show there is no escape for the consequences of treason. And ultimately, if you consider that Shakespeare is writing the play as a warning against committing the act of regicide, you have that real emphasis there that if you go against king and country, the consequences are deathly and from which you cannot escape. If we look at the quotes that we could use for that, because it really does fit in nicely to lots of essays and lots of themes, we begin with the description of Macbeth unseaming the traitor from the knave to the chops, and you can link that to ideas around the hypermasculine Jacobean society, and then you can start to get really high level there. And when you analyse that, especially that word unseamed, you can start to suggest that actually that is excessive violence to kill the traitor. And perhaps Macbeth is behaving in that way as a consequence of his own hamartia, because perhaps Macbeth wants to impress King Duncan and act on his ambition to gain further status. And then at the end, you have the character of Macduff, who we know is a symbol of loyalty, and he beheads Macbeth, who has become a traitor, and you've got there the usurper's cursed head. And I suppose it encapsulates the idea that really there is no way that you can usurp and retain power. Now, that links on nicely to the next idea that you can put in almost any essay, and you can talk Year 11 about the paradox of usurped power, and essentially that is symbolised in the banquet scene, because that is the climactic turning point in the tragedy, but actually it is Macbeth's moment of most and least power. And really, Shakespeare is showing us that illegitimate kingship or illegitimate power that we have taken against the natural order, is no real power at all. So again, it's emphasising that stark warning not to commit regicide. Obviously, in terms of your quotes there, you've got the symbolism of the table being full and the idea that actually there's no place in Scotland for corrupt power. It's a really simple one, but it's a beautiful one to analyse. You've got Banquo's ghost sitting in Macbeth's chair, and perhaps you've got those ideas that of guilt coming through there, and you can look at the image of the blood-covered Banquo and the phantasmagorical image, the hallucination in Macbeth's mind of guilt, but you can also look at it from the perspective of that Macbeth is fundamentally descending into madness. Even before he has been punished by society, even before Macduff and Malcolm have begun to seek revenge, he is plagued ultimately by his own mind. Interesting quote, if you are asked about women and gender and the character of Lady Macbeth, you've got Lady Macbeth at that banquet saying the fit is but momentary. We see here that in the patriarchal society, she realises that the only way she can hold on to that power is through her husband, and therefore she's pleading with guests at this banquet and perhaps trying to reassure herself that it is just momentary, because she realises without Macbeth she would lose that power. Then we have the symbolism of disruption in the natural world. And I know depending on what class you are in, you might have learnt different quotes for this, but I've listed them all below. And actually, this is a really nice idea that it's really good to analyse for symbolism, because after the regicide is committed, Scotland seems to descend into chaos. You've got the simple quote that things turned wild in nature, and you can obviously analyse wild and look at the ideas of that primitive behaviour. You can look at, again from Act 2, the earth was so feverish and did shake. And obviously you've got that imagery of that storm, which is quite literally showing the chaos and symbolising the chaos in the natural world after the act of regicide, the deed has been committed. But you also have that symbolism of feverish there, and you have the idea that not only are tensions rising and Scotland's becoming heated, but Scotland actually is unwell as a consequence of that. Then you've got the ones from Act 4. You've got Malcolm saying, I think our country sinks, and that idea of the loss of a country if there is that illegitimate king. And Macduff saying, bleed, bleed, poor country. Now, there's lots you can say from a character perspective about that quote of Macduff and how he puts country before family. But actually, that idea of that country bleeding shows the kind of wound and the destruction, and perhaps foreshadows the death of a country if legitimate power is not restored. Coming down, obviously, you've got the debilitating nature of guilt. And you can pretty much talk about that in any essay, because you can talk about how in the play guilt is symbolised by blood, and men's minds cannot cope with the consequences of immoral sin. So even if society does not punish you, you will have that internal conflict, that internal turmoil. And you've got lots of references to blood throughout the play. And as just a general point of analysis, the fact Shakespeare uses this repeated motif of blood shows the idea that guilt itself is inescapable. But you've got make thick my blood, which is Lady Macbeth, before she's even done anything. So she already knows the idea that guilt is inescapable. And even when, she says a little water clears us of this deed, by the end she can't get rid of the smell of the blood. Will all the perfumes of Arabia sweeten this little hand? There are lots of quotes on there, but I'm sure you'll be really familiar with those blood quotes. But actually you can interweave that idea about guilt into lots of essays. Now this next one is really kind of predominantly about gender and Lady Macbeth, but it links nicely to ideas of power as well, because it's very easy to make the sweeping statement, well, Lady Macbeth subverts the gender norms. Lady Macbeth subverts patriarchal expectations. Lady Macbeth is presented as a powerful character. But it's much more high level and much more sophisticated to see Shakespeare's play as a warning against giving women power. And if you think about that idea of natural order, those patriarchal expectations, women would have been expected not to be exposed to power and violence, and perhaps exist within the domestic sphere. So we have this idea that on a surface level, Lady Macbeth subverts patriarchal expectations. And yes, we must acknowledge she does have power. She is a Machiavellian villain who's able to manipulate Macbeth. But she's able to do that because he makes her my dearest partner in greatness. He gives her that power. But it's actually a warning to men not to do that, because on closer inspection, she basically can't cope with the power, she can't cope with the violence, and she can't maintain that, and she descends into madness, sleepwalks off the battlements. And that quote, will all the perfumes of Arabia sweeten this little hand? you can almost read that as her desperation to regain her femininity there at that point. And obviously the last one here just links to the idea of tragedy, and it can be quite easily overlooked that Macbeth is a classic tragic hero, but he follows Aristotle's conventions of tragedy, and the very fact the play is a tragedy, and therefore the tragic hero experiences his downfall, actually serves to warn us against acting with unchecked ambition. So that's quite an interesting one. And obviously my mind is full of scorpions kind of shows that although he has these corrupting forces from the witches and from Lady Macbeth, and we can see those evil forces plaguing him, we can also see that sense that actually it is that his own hamartia which is the ultimate cause. And obviously I bring the poison chalice to my own lips there is a nice quote as well. So as I said, what we're going to look at is just some questions that we perhaps wouldn't want to come up and what we could actually say in response to those questions. So we're going to begin by imagining that Banquo comes up, and we're going to look at the extract from Act 3, Scene 1. And at this point in the play, Macbeth has been crowned king, but Banquo suspects that Macbeth killed Duncan. So the question might be phrased, starting with this moment in the play, how does Shakespeare present the character of Banquo? So I've got the extract on the screen here for you. Hopefully you can see that reasonably well, and you can pause and have a little scan through the extract. But what I've put together is a very brief essay plan for you here of actually what I would say. So what would I pick out of the extract? Well, I'd pick out, I fear thou played most foully for it. Because actually that presents Banquo as quite wise. He's kind of aware of Macbeth's sin. He's aware of what Macbeth has done. It's interesting that we have that word foully used there when we think about the very opening scene, and fair is foul and foul is fair, because it's almost that sense that Banquo is suggesting knowingly that not only has he committed something wrong and sinful and disgusting, all of those connotations we have of something foul, there's the kind of subtle suggestion that he's acted on the witch's prophecies, which remember he was there to hear. So there is that suggestion that Banquo is aware that the witches have corrupted Macbeth. But actually we can look at that idea that Banquo is wise at that point, and we absolutely should have that layer of analysis. But again, I would be using those sentence starters of on a surface level and on closer inspection. And from that point I would make about Banquo, I'd go on to say actually on a surface level, Banquo is presented as wise. He seems knowing. His suspicions of Macbeth highlight and emphasize how he has taken the righteous path, but he fears the consequences of his friend acting upon the promises of this corrupted force. But then I would look at it on a closer level, and I would say on closer inspection, later in the extract, it's possible to be critical of Banquo because he's very complimentary to Macbeth's face. Command upon me to which my duties, my good lord. So we have a sense that perhaps Banquo's own ambition, perhaps Banquo's own over-ambition, as a consequence of that promise his children will be kings and his desire to have that line and lineage in his family, leads him not to say anything, not to tell people about his fears of Macbeth's corruption. And therefore we can look at that as a criticism. And actually Banquo is quite deceitful here because he's being very nice to Macbeth. He's not telling Macbeth actually that he suspects him, and he's not suggesting and not kind of whistleblowing on Macbeth for what he fears he's done. So it's quite interesting. Right, these instruments of darkness tell us truths. Can the devil speak true? I would start, if I was going to ask a question on Banquo, with the inciting action. I would point out really simply that Banquo and Macbeth both receive prophecies, but that Banquo seems wiser to the power of the supernatural and the corrupt power. I would obviously be analysing the word instruments, and I would be talking about how they orchestrate Macbeth's downfall. The fact he says, can the devil speak true, when Macbeth is awarded as Thane of Cawdor? I would definitely be zooming in on that word devil and emphasising that he seems aware of the malevolence of the supernatural, and that idea that that's that stark juxtaposition from the divinity of kings, the divine right of kings, showing the king is chosen by God, and actually these witches suggesting that Macbeth could be king. So that's an interesting line to look at, and how his reaction almost is a foil reaction to Macbeth's. Then I would go down actually in my next paragraph to look at Act 1, Scene 6, and this is when Banquo and Duncan go to the Macbeth's castle, and he says the heaven's breath smells wooingly here. And I would look at that and say, actually, although he's wise, he can be a little bit naive, because actually he doesn't realise, in the same way Duncan doesn't realise, that he's going to be killed. And perhaps he's commenting on the great show that Macbeth is putting on. But likewise, there is that irony that he doesn't realise what is coming towards him. Now, at the beginning of Act 2, you have an interesting quote where Banquo can't sleep. Now, if you think about after the act of regicide, that Macbeth cries out, Macbeth hath murdered sleep. And we can look at sleep as that idea of that inner peace. That's quite in itself interesting. Because he says, a heavy summons lies like lead upon me, and yet I would not sleep. So perhaps it's the idea that he feels weighed down, burdened by knowing of the prophecies and knowing how they have likely corrupted Macbeth. But actually, it could also be that sense of when we engage with the supernatural in any form, they kind of corrupt us and they take away our peace. So just an interesting one to perhaps mention. And then my final paragraph, I would look at the Banquo's ghost. And I would look at actually how Banquo's ghost haunts Macbeth, because actually the prophecies of his children being heirs, remember Fleance flees. So I would look at the symbolism of how Banquo actually haunts Macbeth, and it kind of shows that good overcomes evil in that way, or good plagues evil in that way. I would look at how Banquo sitting in the chair kind of symbolises how Banquo's heirs perhaps would be better kings than Macbeth because they didn't act upon the prophecies. But I would also look at the guilt Macbeth faces in his relationship with Banquo, and how he's acted so much on his overambition that he's ended up killing his friend, and that sense of sympathy and regret perhaps that we as an audience feel for the character of Banquo. So yes, if Banquo comes up, it is really tricky, but have a think about those quotes yourself. Think about what you could say about the character of Banquo, and make sure you have a rough plan, an idea ready. So moving on then, we're going to look at Macduff. Now Macduff could come up. He also could come up alongside a theme like loyalty. And if the idea of loyalty came up, you'd absolutely want to be talking about the character of Macduff, because Macduff ultimately is a symbol of loyalty in the play. Arguably, he displays too much loyalty towards Scotland at the consequence of displaying that loyalty towards his family. But it's interesting all the same. And you could get Macduff on its own. So this is a possible question. Read the following extract from Act 4, Scene 3, and then answer the question that follows. At this point in the play, Macbeth's orders for the death of Macduff's family have been carried out. Malcolm and Macduff have already formed an alliance and are planning to overthrow Macbeth. So if we look at our extract here, what would we pick out to say? Well, actually, I would begin by saying a paragraph on how Macduff, perhaps in this moment, feels a sense of regret. Perhaps actually he feels a sense of regret that he has put country before his family, and actually there's a sense of rage and anger at Macbeth. He questions, what, all my pretty chickens? So there's that almost sense of disbelief in Macduff at the horror initially. But then he describes his wife and children who've been killed as the thing that is most precious to him, which in itself is powerful. He also shows this kind of softer side that goes against these hyper-masculine norms when he says, but I must also feel it as a man. So we see that kind of sense that Macduff feels that great sense of sorrow, perhaps that sense of guilt, but that real sadness at what Macbeth has done. But interestingly, he notes fell slaughter on their soul. So there's no doubt in Macduff's mind at this point that Macbeth is a corrupt king. And we kind of see his desire for revenge, that idea that there fell slaughter on their soul. It's that anger, that bitterness at what Macbeth has been allowed to do. Once I'd got rid of the extract part, I would look at these key aspects of Macduff's character. I would look at him immediately after the murder, and the famous quote where he cries out, horror, 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 my tongue nor heart cannot conceive nor name thee. And I would obviously look at that to say how actually, he's somewhat blind to the corruption in society. He can't believe that somebody would commit the act of regicide. He cannot believe that that kind of corruption and illness would exist within society. The repetition of horror is a really simple technique. You can talk about his genuine disbelief, his genuine outrage, but equally his kind of awareness of the significance of the king who's been chosen by God being killed. My tongue nor heart cannot conceive nor name thee. The fact that he can't speak of it, the imagery of his tongue kind of suggests perhaps that instantly, because he cannot name thee, instantly there is that suspicion there. But the idea his heart cannot conceive shows that loyalty towards Duncan. Now, there is again in that scene a further emphasis though of Macduff's blindness, because again we have that repetition in a woman's ear would murder. Now, of course, Lady Macbeth has been the one to get the daggers, frame the guards, and ultimately manipulate and corrupt Macbeth. So it's again that blindness. Is he blind to the true evil that exists within society? Then I would come down and I would look at how Macduff is really aware of the consequences of these crimes in society. And I would look at the quote, bleed, bleed, poor country. I would link that actually really simply to the idea that he knows the consequences of illegitimate power, but equally he puts country before his family. And it's that symbolism of unwavering loyalty to king and country. The imagery Scotland bleeds shows that imagery of that open wound that illegitimate kingship has left. And the idea he calls it a poor country, and the bleeding shows that personification of the country and the heartfelt feelings he has towards it. Then coming down to very nearly the end of the play when he's talking about slaying Macbeth. And of course, it's no coincidence that Macduff is the one to restore justice at the end of the play. Some interesting ideas about Malcolm and kingship, which I'll come on to later, but that we probably wouldn't look at in a Macduff essay. But Macduff restores justice and natural order at the end of the play because he is a symbol of loyalty. And he's this great man who is very much for king and country. But we have to look at perhaps his selfish motives for revenge. And actually, does he want to be the one to take down Macbeth? Because he says, my wife's and children's ghosts will haunt me still. So it's that sense of unfinished business, and that idea of haunt kind of links to these phantasmagorical images that have gone throughout the play, and that repetition and that recurrence of guilt. And that still shows that until he has slain Macbeth, until he has slain the one that has caused him such suffering, he will not be able to rid his mind of the plague of guilt. So interesting that you can link that to guilt as well. Obviously, though, really clear point you would make at the end of your essay is he restores justice. He calls Macbeth, Macbeth's beheaded head, the usurper's cursed head. You'd link that to the cyclical structure, and you'd also look at the fact Macduff commits regicide. Macduff does kill the king. Macbeth is king when he kills him, but he commits regicide for this very selfless reason, to restore natural order and bring peace to Scotland. So Macduff is presented in this truly heroic way rather than this tragically heroic way. So again, although we perhaps wouldn't in an ideal world want a question on Banquo or Macduff, there are 2 essay plans there which would allow you to explore those ideas. And at the very least, not only are you prepared for these questions, but actually you've got these ideas of if loyalty come up, if kingship come up, if revenge came up, if guilt came up, you've got some extra ideas there. Okay, so thinking about King Duncan then, and a possible question. Now, I don't necessarily think King Duncan would come up on his own, but if the idea of kingship came up, well, King Duncan is very much central to that. So I'm going to look at the extract from Act 1, Scene 6. And at this point in the play, Duncan has arrived at Macbeth's castle following victory in battle. And starting with this moment, how does Shakespeare present the character of King Duncan? So a quote actually lots of you will have looked at in relative detail is the fact that Duncan calls Lady Macbeth our honoured hostess. Well, instantly there you have dramatic irony because her intention is to kill him. So she's not really an honoured hostess, so the dramatic irony instantly emphasises his blindness. But again, throughout this extract, we have reminders and emphasis on Duncan's blindness to what is really happening in his country, which is somewhat ironic because, earlier on he said there's no art to find the man's construction in the face. Well, actually, there is an art to it because he can't really work out what men are thinking. And actually, the whole of Scotland seems to be going against him and trying to usurp his power. So is he too trusting? The dramatic irony would certainly suggest so, especially of Lady Macbeth, describing her as our honoured hostess. You also have Where's the Thane of Cawdor? Now, I think it's interesting that that title is repeated because actually that title, Where's the Thane of Cawdor? Well, that title in itself reminds us that the previous Thane of Cawdor was a traitor as well. So it's kind of that emphasis. But We Love Him Highly about Macbeth really evokes a sense of pathos for Duncan. We can't ignore the sense of sympathy and pity we feel for the character of Duncan in that moment because it's, he says something as well about him being there in double trust. But actually the fact he says we love him highly kind of makes us feel a deep sense of sympathy, especially given that that Macbeth goes on to kill him. So actually, after looking at that extract, I'd go right back to the beginning and I'd look at how Duncan is perhaps a good king because he praises and rewards people. When he gives Macbeth the title of Thane of Cawdor for his bravery in battle, with his former title, Greet Macbeth, and the fact he calls him a valiant cousin and a worthy gentleman. All of that's really significant about Duncan because on a surface level, you can say, well, actually, the character of Duncan is a good king. He rewards those who defend his country. He rewards bravery. He's respected in a sense, and he respects his thanes. He has that close relationship with his thanes. But on closer inspection, you can say, well, actually, the previous Thane of Cawdor was a traitor. So to what extent is this, to what extent is this a good system? And you can look at the hyper-masculine society and the idea that does Macbeth's bravery and violence, basically, is it a means of fulfilling his over-ambition? Because he wants to be rewarded in Scotland under Duncan, where those hyper-masculine norms of excessive violence are rewarded. Then I would come down and I would look at this idea really deeply that he is too trusting. I would look at the irony. There's no art to find the man's construction in the face. Basically, there he is saying it's not difficult to work out what men are thinking. But yet in the same scene, Macbeth steps to the aside and says, stars hide your fires, let not light see my black and deep desires. And he also says, on the Prince of Cumberland, I must overleap. So the fact it is an aside as a staging technique there is in itself significant, because the fact it is an aside symbolises the fact that Duncan is still on stage. Duncan is blind to the corruption, yet he thinks he is not. Then I would actually come down, if I was continuing with this essay, and I would look at Macbeth, who actually commits the regicide against Duncan, and his positive view of Duncan. He says, he hath honoured me of late. So he's kind of, he has that close relationship with Duncan. He admires and respects how he honours him. And also, Macbeth says, the angels will plead, trumpet-tongued. So there's that sense that he is he is a pure king. And that idea, the angels will plead, it emphasises that he's innocent and that he doesn't deserve this suffering. But actually, he's someone that is an inherently good person. And just as a final point, I'd link it to the divinity of kingship. And that when Malcolm, his son, and who he chose, is restored as king, Scotland is able to heal because he is with golden blood. And I would link that imagery to actually the divine right of kings. And you could perhaps link that to the chaos in nature when there is not that divine king chosen by God. So again, I don't imagine Duncan would come up on his own. He's obviously, unfortunately for him, only in the very beginning of the play. But actually, if Duncan was to come up, or if there was a Duncan extract linked to the theme of kingship, then that would hopefully give you some ideas with which you could expand an essay. Okay, so my prediction for the exam, and obviously it is only that, it is a prediction, but is around the idea of kingship and power. Now, what I would like us to look at is the very end of the play here, and the point where Macbeth is about to be killed by Macduff. And I want us to look at how the idea of kingship is presented there. Kingship is such a nice theme, and obviously if it did come up, there would be lots of opportunities to talk about lots of the big ideas that you know inside out. But you can't miss the obvious point that the idea around kingship is that if kingship is illegitimate and kingship is not in the natural order, that corruption will plague us. And actually that corrupted power is no power at all. Okay, so looking at this extract then, it's obviously where Macduff is about to kill Macbeth. Now, Macduff says a few interesting things here. He says, our rarer monsters are. Now, that kind of suggests that what Macbeth has done is so abhorrent and disgusting that he is so monstrous that it is almost rare in society. And he then says, here may you see the tyrant, and yet I will try their last. Sorry, that's by Macbeth, that last bit. Here may you see the tyrant, and that imagery of Macbeth's head on a stick. Now that links to the cyclical structure, but it's Macduff's determination to bring down that illegitimate king, because Macbeth's kingship is fundamentally not loyal to Scotland. The imagery of his head being on a stick and him being beheaded as a kind of signal and a warning links to that cyclical structure, that there are no ways of escaping the consequences of treason. But actually you have an interesting quote from Macbeth in this extract about kingship. Yet I will try the last is in itself really interesting, because it's that sense that kingship is such a reward to Macbeth, who is fueled by his overambition and power. Even when he sees that the witches have betrayed him and that the second prophecies were exactly that, half-truths, he will not give up on his quest for power. So that in itself is really, really interesting, because it shows that the preciousness of kingship to Macbeth, his nihilistic state that he's not going to give up, but actually, it shows his foolishness, because ultimately we see that illegitimate kingship will always be banished. After I'd looked at the extract and had got that out of the way, I would move on to the paradox of the banquet and say that is Macbeth's moment as king, but actually it's no power at all, because he descends into madness. The table is full. There's no place in Scotland for usurped power. All of those things, because actually that is probably your biggest idea about kingship, that if you usurp power to overthrow the king and you take that power yourself, then you might be king in title, you might be crowned king, but you are no real king. Then I would look at a title actually for a quote, from the end of the play, and I would look at the imagery of him being a dwarfish thief of the title, and that metaphor does feel his title hang around him like a giant robe on a dwarfish thief. And I would look at the dwarfish thief as a symbol, a metaphor for Macbeth, and that idea that he's stolen power that is not his. But I'd look at the symbolism of the giant robe and the significance of the title of king. Then I would probably look at a contrast to Duncan in another paragraph, and actually the difference between a good and a bad king, and the imagery of with golden blood, and the angels will plead trumpet-tongued. But I certainly wouldn't miss my opportunity to explore the idea that Duncan himself was not necessarily a good king, that Duncan was perhaps too trusting. When he says in Act 1, Scene 4, is execution done on Cawdor, we see the fact that he has had to have one of his thanes killed because he's gone against king and country. Then Macbeth obviously does the same. So it's that sense that he perhaps doesn't really know what's going on. He's not really sure if the old thane of Cawdor has been killed. But likewise, you have the idea that actually he's running a society, he's running a country in which his thanes, his noblemen, rebel against him. You also have the fact that Duncan describes Macbeth as a man on whom I built absolute trust. And there again you see that naivety, and that Duncan himself is flawed, albeit in a very different way to Macbeth. But is Duncan a bad king responsible for his own downfall in much the same way that Macbeth is a bad king responsible for his own downfall? Now, the reason Kingship, though, is such a lovely essay is you obviously can talk about the symbolism of the disruption in nature and the ideas around that. But and actually, when there's an illegitimate king, the whole of society becomes disrupted and chaotic. But you can actually look at the idea of Malcolm. Now, Malcolm is restored as king at the end, as per Duncan's wishes, and natural order is restored. But it's interesting that Malcolm himself does not fight against Macbeth. And it's also interesting that Malcolm himself flees when the tension in Scotland is heating up. So it's almost perhaps, and this is getting very high level, but is Shakespeare suggesting that Malcolm is that shrewd politician and that person who's willing to get other people to slay the enemy for him is a better king? You also have that juxtaposition between Malcolm and Duncan when Malcolm says there are daggers in men's smiles. And that metaphor of the daggers is obviously the evil and the corruption. But again, there are daggers in men's smiles emphasises the idea that he can see that corruption in society.